So much of my eating disorder lay in the compensating and the micromanagement and the conditions around my food and what I was allowed to eat and all of those hoops. It was so much less about specific foods that I wouldn't allow myself to eat. It was all about the conditions under which I was supposed to eat them. The rules and the compensations and the conditions, they were endless and they always changed. I think that made it one of the hardest things to challenge here was that those rules were constantly shape-shifting. If you'd asked me to write down those rules, I actually found that really hard because obviously I tried to do that so many times, but they just morphed and it was almost like I could challenge them to a point and it was all of a sudden like all of these next bits were okay. That became my new safety net, but I still didn't feel free. And that was because I had reached the end of my eating disorder's leash. But what I knew so clearly was that I just didn't feel free. The freedom and the peace that people on the other side of recovery talked about was not at all where I was. And I think it came back to this feeling of compensating and micromanagement, which underneath it all was just upheld by this idea that there was a ceiling, that there was an amount of whatever, but overall food that was unacceptable, that I couldn't go over this ceiling. It's a big reason why I liked to save up my eating until the evening. I think there's a lot of reasons that happens, and I think a lot of people can relate to it. I didn't want to use up too much of what I thought was allowed earlier in the day, just in case something spontaneous came up. Someone suggested that we go out for a drink, we go and get some ice cream, we go out for dinner. I always felt like I wanted to have a buffer. This is such an eating disorder behavior. This is not food freedom. And this idea of going out for a meal was probably one of the biggest parts of my eating disorder that I felt like I had to restrict leading up to going out for dinner. Days where I wasn't planning to go out, I felt reasonably okay. It felt like I could eat consistently throughout the day. I had regular, adequate, varied meals quite a lot of the time. But those days where I was going out for dinner, it totally changed. And it was like it was all I could think about. And then my whole day was micromanaged around it. It is so disordered. It has been called, I believe, event restriction. I didn't have a name for it at the time. I just knew it was a behavior that I did. And I knew it was one of my biggest behaviors that really had to go. And one of the reasons that I did this event restriction, and if it's something that you do too, you'll probably resonate with this, it was because I felt like it would give me a feeling of comfort, a feeling of ease, and it would let me be more free and flexible when it came to eating out later. And let me tell you that the opposite was true. I would turn up hangry and irritable and stressed and anxious, and it would actually be quite the opposite. I would be much more hesitant, much more cautious about what I ate. And this is that idea that I now can see so clearly on the other side, is that restriction creates more restriction. It sends traffic down that neural network. So it's alive, it is ready to go. And in the opposite way, abundance begets abundance. So I knew that this was not serving my recovery. It was not a depiction of unconditional permission to eat. It was a very, very conditional existence. I was not letting myself eat based on future decisions. In order to challenge this, I decided that I had to go in the opposite direction as far as I could. It was not going to work if I just tried to sort of hone in and challenge a specific small rule around that. It was so important for me that I smashed that ceiling, that I went so far in the opposite direction that if I knew I was going to go out for dinner, I had to make it my mission to eat as much as possible during the day. I had to totally snap that leash. And what happened the first time that I did this, that I built up the gumption and the commitment and I followed through with my actions to eat without restriction and to proactively challenge that rule before I was going out for dinner, I expected to feel racked with guilt. I expected to feel so anxious and so guilty and to hate going out, to really not be present, to not enjoy my meal out with my partner. But that was so not my experience. The opposite was true. I was much more relaxed. I was much more myself. I was able to be present. I was able to laugh. I was able to order what I wanted from the menu. And it just goes to show that if you stop sending traffic down that restrictive neural network, it can create this feeling of freedom, this feeling of flexibility, and simply you're more nourished. I think that that's a really key thing that we can't overlook here, is that being in a nourished state means that you're able to be present, that you're not constantly thinking about food, that you're able to make decisions that are much more connected to your core self in a nourished state. It was just more evidence that I could gather up to use throughout the rest of my recovery, where actioning my unconditional permission to eat made it easier to continue with that abundant mindset. This isn't to say it wasn't hard. I can sit here with a lot of clarity now and a lot of confidence that that is the right course of action. But when I was going through it, there was a lot more doubt. There was a lot of anxiety. The eating disorder absolutely thrives in that decision-making process. That's where it's got time and the ability to intercept your decisions before you take action. It just lives in the anxiety of each food decision. So I want to talk about some of the techniques that I used to keep myself accountable and to follow through with those pro-recovery actions. Firstly, I would question if this was a behavior that I wanted to carry through for the rest of my life. Did I want to live my life restricting my intake during the day, having a ceiling during the day to allow me to go out for dinner? The answer to that was a resounding no. Every time it was, I don't want to do this behavior in my future life, so I need to stop it today. I am not going to keep doing something today that I don't want in my future life. I had to really ground myself in the present and say, I'm not doing that today because I don't want to do it tomorrow. I don't want to do it in a year, and I certainly don't want to be doing it for the rest of my life. I found that to be a really powerful way of zooming out and not getting lost in the anxiety, not getting lost in the minutiae and the every little detail that my eating disorder wanted to get involved in. If I didn't want to do it in the future, I had to stop doing it today. Secondly, I came back to my recovery commitment of doing the opposite actions to my eating disorder. I knew that my eating disorder wanted me to restrict. So the boldest decision I could make in the opposite direction was to eat as much as possible before going out for a meal. As I've mentioned before, these recovery commitments just simplified my choices in that moment. There was no debating whether this was an eating disorder driven thought. It absolutely was. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that it was disordered. And my commitment, therefore, was to do the opposite action. Another thing that I did was to write down my recovery whys, to really connect me to the bigger picture, to connect me to why I was putting in this effort right now. Again, it's a bit related to my first point, but it was the act of writing it down that really connected me to that vision, the values, the person I wanted to be, the life I wanted to live. That, to me, was a really powerful technique in the moment to help me commit and follow through with those recovery actions. Next, I distracted myself as best that I could. This wasn't so much a distraction from the eating, this was a distraction from the backlash. It was also a distraction from the anxiety. I have committed to doing this, I don't need to keep thinking it. I've committed, let's go and do something else. I've eaten this thing, let's go and distract. And I've talked a lot about some of those restful distractions, and it's up to you to find your own. Some that helped me, as I said, I've talked about this in other videos, but watching comforting TV shows or films, it was reading, it was singing, it was calling people. I think just talking about things that aren't eating disorder related. It's so nice to just be reminded that the bigger, wider world exists, and maybe it's not all that important that I haven't restricted today. Maybe these people in my life want to talk to me just because I'm a nice person and I have value in their life. There are lots of ways to distract without doing any form of movement or being productive, and I encourage you to try a few different ones on for size and see which suits you best, which provides the best distraction for you. And lastly, I would try to surround myself with people who had a very healthy relationship with food, especially on those days where we were going out for dinner. I was lucky to have friends and family and my partner, who was often around, to model a really healthy relationship with food. Are there people in your surroundings or your community who do have that very healthy relationship with food, especially when it comes to compensatory behavior, who don't engage in any kind of compensation, and you can be with them for extended periods of time? So as I said, this was a big one for me, but compensation or food juggling can turn up in so many different ways. And it did for me. This was not the only way it turned up, but I think it is important that we identify the compensations that are going on and we take active steps to challenge it. We need to keep repeating that opposite action until whatever that compensatory behavior looks like is neutralized, until it requires very little thought to do the opposite action. In fact, it probably doesn't even come into your consciousness that this now is an opposite action. And I know that it is easy sitting where I am from a place of full recovery to say, repeat the hard things until it's rewired. But that is recovery. That's the whole game. It can be uncomfortable. It can be actually, as I experienced, revelatory. It can be a positive experience. So I don't want to sit here and say it's going to be doom and gloom. Yes, there may well be anxiety. There may well be backlash, and we can predict that and manage it. But the other thing I want to remind you of is it's not always what you expect, and it's not always what the eating disorder expects. Sometimes doing the opposite action, like resting or eating lots, can be exactly what your body wants. Often it's what your body wants. And if you can let it be easy, if you can let that positive reaction manifest in your body, then you can again use that to keep you going, to keep that evidence in the front of your mind for the next time that you have doubts. But compensatory behaviors are not the type of thing that will just go away on their own. They need to be actively identified and actively challenged. It's about recognizing where this behavior is showing up and that correctly identifying that you don't want it in your future life, that this behavior doesn't form part of recovered. So we need to stop it now. You actively have to address it in the present. So I hope that has helped, and remember that you will likely not feel ready to challenge this compensatory behavior, but make the decision to be ready anyway, to go and smash those neural networks. If you don't want it in your future life, don't entertain it today. So take care, go smash recovery, and I'll talk to you soon.